Mack, Daz and Rico weren't just street hustlers. They were the architects of Liverpool's most feared cocaine empire. On the shadowed docks of the Mersey, they built a network so ruthless, so precise, that no one dared challenge them, until betrayal and blood threatened to tear it all apart. Liverpool's docks had long been the city's lifeblood, where the hum of cranes and the scent of salt water once mingled with the commerce of legitimate trade. But by the early 2000s, many of the warehouses were abandoned, the piers rusting under the grey English sky. For most, the docks were a forgotten part of the city, a place where shadows stretched long and danger felt closer than the streetlights. For Mack, a man with an uncanny ability to see opportunity where others saw decay, the docks were a kingdom waiting to be claimed. Mack was a man of contradictions. He carried himself with the calm assurance of someone who had nothing to fear. Yet beneath his composed exterior lurked a ruthlessness that few could match. He had grown up on Liverpool's rough streets, learning early that survival depended on brains as much as brawn. By his late 20s, he had built a reputation as someone willing to take risks no one else would, someone who could turn the smallest chance into a fortune. He started small, recruiting a crew of local men, who were skilled in different ways. Some knew the docks like the back of their hands, able to navigate the labyrinth of warehouses, shipping containers and hidden alleys without leaving a trace. Others had a knack for logistics, understanding how to move goods swiftly, quietly and efficiently. Mack's talent was in seeing how these disparate skills could be combined into a network that could run almost invisibly under the radar of law enforcement. The first ventures were cautious. Cigarettes, alcohol and occasional small shipments of imported goods moved through their hands. Each successful operation added confidence and credibility, both within the crew and across the city's underworld. But it was a chance encounter with a South American smuggler that changed everything. The man offered Mack a small shipment of cocaine, promising huge returns if it reached the streets of Europe. It was dangerous, far more so than anything Mack had attempted before, but the potential profits were astronomical. The crew adapted quickly. Under Mack's orders, the docks were transformed into a carefully orchestrated operation. Shipments arrived under the cover of night, offloaded by men who moved like shadows. Crates were hidden among legitimate goods or broken down into smaller packages, making them almost impossible to trace. Corrupt port workers and customs officials became allies, either paid off or intimidated into compliance. Mack's genius lay in his ability to anticipate every obstacle, turning what could have been chaos into a precise, well-oiled system. Word of their success spread quietly at first. Rival gangs watched with interest, sensing that a new power was rising, but Mack's crew was careful to avoid unnecessary attention. Violence was used sparingly, reserved only for those who threatened the operation or betrayed trust. This combination of discretion and ruthlessness allowed the crew to togo steadily, accumulating wealth and influence without attracting immediate law enforcement scrutiny. Yet the docks remained dangerous. The same shadows that provided cover also concealed threats. Smugglers from other cities, desperate criminals, and informants all posed constant risks. Mack instilled a strict code among his crew, loyalty above all, and suspicion of outsiders. Each member knew that even a single mistake could bring ruin. It was a delicate balance between ambition and paranoia, trust and vigilance. As the first shipments of cocaine reached the streets, the crew began to understand the full scale of what they had created. Liverpool, once a city of faded industrial glory, was quietly transforming into a hub of a growing European cocaine network. Mack's eyes, always scanning, always calculating, saw only potential. The docks were no longer merely a place of commerce, they were the foundation of an empire. And while the risk of discovery, betrayal and violence loomed, Mack knew one thing with certainty: fortune favored the bold, and in the shadow of the Mersey, boldness was the only currency that mattered. By the time Mack's crew had firmly established itself along the Mersey, Liverpool was changing in ways that mirrored their own rise. The city's skyline, once dominated by crumbling factories and neglected warehouses, now featured high-rise apartments and luxury development. Streets that had long carried only the echoes of unemployment and despair were increasingly lined with sleek cars and flashy motorbikes. Mack's influence was subtle at first, hidden beneath the hum of legitimate city life, but it spread like a shadow, creeping into every corner of the docks and beyond. Mack's strategy was simple: control every part of the cocaine trade, from importation to distribution. The crew expanded aggressively, moving from small street-level deals to a tightly organized network that reached across Liverpool and into neighboring towns. Each member had a role. Some oversaw shipments, others managed street-level sales, and a select few handled finances and bribery. Nothing was left to chance. The crew operated like a machine, precise and relentless, with Mack at the center, calculating risks and rewards with cold efficiency. Warehouses along the Mersey were fortified with security cameras, armed guards, and hidden escape routes. Shipments were broken into smaller loads, moved through back streets, and hidden in plain sight. Mack had learned early that arrogance could be fatal. Every operation was carefully timed, and every route had a contingency plan. Even the police, with all their resources, seemed perpetually a step behind. Each intercepted shipment that never reached its destination was the result of careful planning, not luck. As their power grew, so did their reputation. Fear became their currency. Rival gangs learned quickly that challenging Mack was suicidal. Gun battles and drive-by shootings were used sparingly, but each incident left a message. Loyalty was mandatory, betrayal unthinkable. The crew's methods were calculated, brutal and effective. Word spread quietly through Liverpool's underworld, and soon Mack's name was whispered with both admiration and dread. But with power came tension. The men who had once worked side by side in near-perfect coordination began to show cracks. Ambition, envy, and paranoia crept into the crew. Some men started questioning Mack's decisions, wondering if they were getting their fair share, or if opportunities were being hoarded for the leader alone. Trust, which had once been absolute, began to fray. Mack sensed it but dismissed it as a manageable risk, believing his combination of charisma, intimidation, and foresight would keep the crew in line. Even as the empire expanded, threats lurked everywhere. Rival gangs from Manchester and London were watching closely, looking for weaknesses to exploit. Informants within the police force were always a potential danger, ready to expose the network at the first sign of vulnerability. Mack's genius lay in his anticipation. He identified these threats before they could act and neutralized them quietly, often leaving victims unaware of the forces moving against them until it was too late. The cocaine trade was now so lucrative that it began to attract attention from international suppliers and buyers. Mack's operation became a central hub in a larger European network. The docks, once silent and empty, now pulsed with activity at night. Container ships, fishing vessels, and private yachts all became instruments in an intricate dance of smuggling, diversion, and deception. Every successful operation increased the crew's wealth and influence, but each also carried the risk of exposure. Amid the growing empire, Mack remained vigilant. He knew that power built on fear and secrecy could collapse in an instant. Every ally could be a traitor, every shipment a trap, every night a potential last night. Yet the lure of control, money and domination was intoxicating. The Shadow Empire was no longer just a dream. It was real, and it stretched across Liverpool, invisible yet omnipresent. The docks had become more than a workplace. They were the heart of a criminal kingdom, and Mack, for better or worse, was its sovereign. The first real crack in Mack's empire appeared quietly, almost imperceptibly, but the consequences were devastating. One of his most trusted lieutenants, a man who had stood beside him since the early days of the docks, had been secretly siphoning shipments to a rival gang. At first the losses were small: misplaced containers, shipments arriving late, unexplained shortages, but Mack noticed the pattern. In the world he had built, small mistakes were rarely accidents. Suspicion grew like a dark stain, spreading through the crew. Mack's instincts told him betrayal was at work, and he set out to confirm it without alerting anyone. The crew, once a tightly knit unit, began to feel tension in the air. Eyes flicked nervously over shoulders, whispers followed every plan, and loyalty, once absolute, became tentative. Mack, however, remained calm, outwardly in control. But inside, his mind was calculating, considering the perfect way to punish and to send a warning that would echo across the docks. When the betrayal was finally revealed, the consequences were swift and brutal. The lieutenant had underestimated Mack's network of observation and influence. Every ally he had thought he could trust had been silently reporting back. Mack made the decision to strike publicly, not just to punish the man but to remind everyone of the code he demanded. The punishment was severe and carried out in a way that left no doubt treachery would not be tolerated. The docks themselves seemed to shudder under the weight of the warning. Violence soon escalated beyond that single act of betrayal. Rival gangs, sensing weakness, attempted incursions, testing Mack's defenses. The crew responded ruthlessly. Armed confrontations made them expendable. Alliances shifted subtly. Conversations were monitored, and every action was measured against the possibility of hidden agendas. Mack's leadership was both the glue that held them together and the source of constant fear. Despite the chaos, the Empire's operations continued with remarkable efficiency. Shipments still arrived and departed, warehouses were still secured, and distribution networks remained intact. Mack's meticulous planning ensured that the public face of the organization seemed stable, while behind the scenes, trust was crumbling. Every night, he reviewed maps, shipment logs, and surveillance footage, anticipating threats and plotting contingency. The Empire was a living organism, but even the strongest organisms could collapse if a critical part failed. The human cost became impossible to ignore. Men who had once celebrated victories together were now corpses or fugitives, their absence a grim reminder of the stakes. The docks themselves bore scars, walls pockmarked by bullets, crates burned or shattered, alleyways littered with reminders of the violence that underpinned the Empire. Yet for Mack, each death, each act of treachery, was a lesson, a reinforcement of the rule that loyalty must be absolute, and fear was a tool to maintain it. By the end of the chapter, it became clear that Mack's greatest challenge was no longer external. Rival gangs could be crushed, police investigations thwarted, and shipments rerouted. The real threat came from within, from ambition, envy, and the fragile bonds that tied the crew together. The Empire's foundations, once solid, were now tested by human weakness. Mack knew that in this world, a single misstep could bring everything crashing down, and the docks of Liverpool, the heart of his shadow empire, had never felt more dangerous. By the time Mack began to sense cracks within his crew, a new threat had begun to emerge, one he could not anticipate fully. A rival cartel from Manchester had been watching the Mersey with calculating patience. Unlike previous rivals, they did not move recklessly. Instead, they studied the docks, learned the crew's routines, and identified weaknesses in security and loyalty. What Mack had once believed to be an unshakable empire now faced an enemy with the patience and resources to dismantle it, piece by piece. The first attack was subtle. Shipments were intercepted before they reached the docks, sometimes disappearing entirely, leaving the crews scrambling to cover losses. At first, Mack suspected internal betrayal. The memory of the earlier lieutenant's treachery lingered like a shadow over the Empire. But as the attacks continued, a pattern emerged. The Manchester cartel had infiltrated the supply chain, using insiders who were willing to risk death for a share of profits. Mack's response was immediate and brutal. Security tightened across the docks, shipment routes were altered, and surveillance increased 24 hours a day. The crew moved with heightened caution, but the outside pressure amplified the internal tension. Loyalty was no longer enough to guarantee safety. Even those who had stood beside Mack for years began to fear for their lives. Some quietly aligned with the rival cartel, seeing it as a chance to survive if the Empire fell. Others disappeared entirely, leaving unanswered questions and suspicion in their wake. The Manchester cartel's strategy was methodical. They targeted warehouses, bribed lower-level staff, and even limited local law enforcement through subtle corruption. Shipments that had once arrived without incident were now under constant threat. Explosions, fires, and drive-by shootings became more frequent, each attack more audacious than the last. The docks, once the well-oiled heart of Mack's empire, had become a war zone. Civilians and workers found themselves caught in the crossfire, and fear spread beyond the criminal world into the city itself. Mack realized with a sinking certainty that the empire he had built could no longer rely solely on fear and efficiency. The internal divisions that had once seemed manageable now posed a real danger. Trusted lieutenants questioned his decisions, and key men weighed the risks of loyalty against the promise of survival elsewhere. Every choice became a gamble. Each shipment carried the threat of ambush, each meeting of the crew risked exposure, and every night brought the possibility that the cartel, or even the police, could strike at the empire's core. The tipping point came during a coordinated assault on the docks. Multiple warehouses were hit simultaneously, shipments destroyed, and crew members were killed or captured. Mack narrowly escaped an ambush, forced to navigate a maze of fire and gunfire to reach safety. The sheer scale and precision of the attack revealed the full extent of the cartel's planning and the vulnerability of even the most fortified operations. It was the first time Mack had faced a threat that could not be suppressed by fear or force alone. In the aftermath, the empire's foundations were irreparably shaken. Shipments were delayed or lost, profits plummeted, and alliances fractured. Some of Mack's men, unwilling to risk death, openly joined the rival cartel. Others were arrested in sting operations, orchestrated by authorities who had finally pieced together enough evidence to strike decisively. The docks, once a symbol of power and control, now bore the scars of relentless assault. Burned-out warehouses, shattered containers, and the eerie quiet of operations brought to a halt. Mack, for the first time, understood that he had underestimated the combined force of external pressure and internal weakness. No amount of planning or brutality could fully protect an empire built on crime when enemies were relentless and loyalty fragile. The dream of dominance had crumbled into chaos, leaving behind only a battlefield littered with the remnants of ambition. The Mersey, once the center of a shadow empire, had become a place of retreat and reflection, a reminder that even the most formidable power could fall in an instant when the stakes were highest. The aftermath of the Mersey's violent upheaval left Liverpool scarred, both physically and psychologically. The docks, once humming with the pulse of Mack's empire, were silent, save for the occasional sound of the tide against rusting ships. Crates that had once carried fortunes now lay abandoned, and warehouses stood as hollow monuments to ambition and failure. The city had glimpsed the power and danger of a shadow empire, and the echoes lingered long after the last shipment disappeared. Mack himself vanished from the city as suddenly as he had risen. Some believed he had fled to South America, blending into the chaos of the international cocaine trade. Others whispered that he remained in Liverpool, hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to reclaim what was lost. No trace of him was found, and those who had been closest to him offered no clues. His disappearance added to the legend, casting a long shadow over the docks and ensuring that his name would be whispered in fear and fascination for years to come. The remaining members of the crew fared differently. Some were arrested, their trials revealing fragments of the empire to law enforcement and the public. Others escaped, scattered across Europe, carrying their knowledge and ambition to new cities and new criminal networks. A few had been killed, their bodies left as grim reminders of loyalty's cost. The combination of arrests, deaths, and disappearances shattered the internal cohesion that had once made the empire nearly untouchable. The men who survived were forever marked by what they had done and seen. Liverpool itself struggled to recover from the shadow of the empire. The docks, a place of employment and trade for generations, had become associated with violence, betrayal, and crime. Local communities felt the impact of fear and distrust. Parents warned their children, neighbors looked over shoulders, and whispers of Mack and his crew circulated like a dark folk tale. The cocaine trade, though diminished, never disappeared entirely. Smaller gangs filled the vacuum left by Mack, but none could recreate the structure, efficiency, or reputation of the shadow empire that had dominated the Mersey. For those who had watched from the outside, the story of Mack and his crew served as both fascination and caution. The rise of the empire had been meteoric, built on intelligence, ruthlessness, and ambition. Its fall was equally dramatic, fueled by external threats, betrayal, and the limits of loyalty. The lessons were clear. Power built on crime was fragile, trust was a rare commodity, and the price of ambition could be measured in blood, fear, and lost lives. Yet, despite the destruction and loss, the shadow of the empire persisted. Warehouse doors remained locked long after the crew's disappearance. Surveillance cameras, abandoned but still functional, reminded observers that someone had once controlled the docks with precision and fear. Local law enforcement kept a wary eye on the docks, knowing that even a whisper of Mack's return could reignite violence. The Mersey, flowing silently past Liverpool, seemed to carry the memory of the empire, as if the river itself had witnessed every deal, every betrayal, and every act of ruthless ambition. In the end, the cocaine kings of the Mersey left a legacy that was impossible to erase. The city had seen what could be achieved with cunning, brutality, and a willingness to risk everything. But it had also seen the consequences. A world where loyalty was fleeting, alliances could not be trusted, and the most powerful men could vanish without a trace. The empire had risen fast, fallen hard, and left behind a cautionary tale whispered through the streets, remembered in the scars of the docks, and felt in the lingering tension of a city that had danced on the edge of shadow and chaos. Liverpool had survived, but the Shadow Empire remained, a dark echo of ambition, fear, and the fleeting nature of power. The docks, the river, and the city itself would never forget. This chapter wraps up the story with a strong sense of aftermath, lingering tension, and the legend of Mack's empire, leaving viewers with a haunting impression.